July 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. The noon heat lies on the prairie like a hammer, cicadas soaring at the air, creosote posts sweating tar, dust rising in little spirals along the outfield fence. A sharp crack splits the glare. Every German along the wire flinches, thinking rifle, then sees it as only a length of ash biting a stitched white ball, 108 red seams turning like a tracer across a square of sun-baked dirt. On the open side of the diamond, Americans in khaki shout and wheel, boots pounding the 90 feet between bases, as if a silent drill sergeant called cadence. The guards watch from the towers with M1 Garand slung easy. The laughter on the field unsettles more than the rifles. They make war and play in the same breath, the prisoner thinks, embarrassed by the grin tugging his mouth. They had come from Tunisia in May, Afrika Korps patches cut away on the dock at New Orleans, trained in artillery tables and convoy spacing, not in this odd geometry drawn in chalk. By the second week, the mockery thins. A Bremen machinist sergeant notes the symmetry. 3 outs end an inning like 3 points make a triangle. 9 men, 9 innings, orders within orders. He watches the catcher's signs as if reading a range card, times the pitcher's motion like a camshaft. In late July, a corporal trades 2 cigarettes for a taped bat. By August, idle noon hours become rule lessons. Strike zone, force play, tag, fair and foul. The jeers turn to wagers over who can pull a clean line past third. When the first German steps into the box, left foot set, right hand choking the handle, the fence feels less like a border and more like a touchline. What began as a laugh is hardening into habit, and the next weeks will show how a game crosses wire faster than any pamphlet. January 1943, the Atlantic winds were harsh enough to peel paint from steel. A Liberty ship, converted to transport prisoners, creaked through the grey swells toward New Orleans. Below deck, rows of German POWs sat shoulder to shoulder, each tagged with his captured unit. Afrika Korps, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe ground crew. Men who had once marched under Rommel's sun, now staring at the rusted hull that smelled of diesel, salt, and despair. They expected another grim stalag, perhaps in the British countryside or somewhere cold and desolate. Instead, as dawn broke over the Gulf, they glimpsed palm trees and the shimmer of heat. One officer muttered, almost offended, "This cannot be the enemy's land. It looks like a holiday." Between 1943 and 1945, nearly 425,000 Germans would follow this same route into the heart of the United States. Trains fanned out from ports like New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, carrying prisoners through landscapes they could scarcely comprehend, fields of cotton, steel mills, orange groves. Camps rose in every corner of the country. Camp Hearne in Texas, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. Barbed wire surrounded them all, but inside the fences stood barracks with wooden floors, mess halls, and, most bewildering of all, recreation yards. Guards greeted them with smiles and cigarettes, a gesture that felt like mockery until they realized it was genuine. America, bound by the Geneva Convention, treated its prisoners with a strange mixture of firmness and fraternity. The War Department's Special Services Division, fearing idleness more than insubordination, issued baseball bats, gloves, and uniforms through the American Red Cross. To the Germans, shaped by Prussian discipline and a lifetime of foosball, this insistence on playing games during war seemed absurd. Real soldiers train, they grumbled. Children play. Yet the Americans kept repeating that baseball was the heart of democracy, where rank, class, and birth meant nothing, and every man stood equal at the plate. The phrase puzzled them then, dismissed as propaganda. But as the months wore on, and the sound of bat against ball echoed through the camps, that baffling American creed began to take root. What had arrived as mere prisoners of war were about to become participants in one of history's most unexpected cultural crossings. Autumn 1943 settled warm over central Texas, the air thick with the smell of mesquite and chalk dust. In the exercise yard of Camp Hearne, a notice appeared on the bulletin board, typed in English, translated beneath in clumsy German, recreation schedule, baseball instruction, 1,500 hours. At first it drew smirks. The men of the Afrika Korps and Wehrmacht thought it another American joke, another attempt to soften them with absurdities. Yet at 3 o'clock sharp, a corporal from the Special Services Division arrived with a crate stamped Louisville Slugger Model 125. Out came bats, a handful of scuffed leather gloves and balls stamped Reach Official League. Within days, mimeographed sheets circulated through the barracks, translating the mysteries of this foreign pastime. Schlagen for batting, Feldmann for fielder, bases for base. The diagrams showed perfect symmetry, 90-foot paths between bases, 60 feet 6 inches from pitcher's mound to plate. To German engineers and machinists, it was the first hint that this child's game was designed with almost mathematical order. Recreation officers explained the logic, how every hit became a ratio, every pitcher's success reducible to decimals, batting average, earned run average, slugging percentage. These words carried the precision of artillery tables. Yet it was not the math that struck them most, it was the fairness. When an umpire shouted, "Out!" the decision stood uncontested, even by the losing side. Authority here was not enforced by rank or punishment, but by rules accepted as binding for all. For men raised under propaganda and command hierarchy, it was disorienting. Discipline without fear, respect without coercion. Soon, they began to practice in earnest. Torn shirts were twisted into makeshift gloves. Chalk lines marked the infield. The rhythm, pitch, swing, catch became its own language, a steady pulse that pushed back against boredom. Laughter faded, replaced by concentration. The same men who once scoffed at baseball now argued over strike zones and fielding positions. In learning the game's geometry, they were absorbing something deeper, an unspoken lesson in order through equality, a quiet contagion of democracy spreading one inning at a time. Spring 1944 arrived early in Texas, the fields around Camp Hearne turning green under a sky that never seemed to rest. By then, the camp, nicknamed the University of the POWs for its lectures, workshops, and strict order, held more than 4,800 German prisoners. Word spread through the barracks that Saturday would bring something new, the first full baseball game played entirely by German teams. For weeks, they had scavenged wood from shipping crates and broken bunks to build crude bleachers. Buckets of chalk, requisitioned from the mess hall, became foul lines. The players named themselves with pride that bordered on defiance. The Afrika Tigers in desert khaki, the Rhine Eagles in patched blue denim. When they took the field, hundreds gathered along the wire, guards included, curious to see whether the experiment would succeed or collapse in confusion. A sergeant from Oklahoma, smiling beneath his campaign hat, stood on the mound for the ceremonial first pitch. The ball arced under the wide Texas sun, the air thick with dust and nervous laughter. The German batter swung with mechanical precision and missed. The crowd roared, not in scorn but in shared amusement, a release of tension no order could command. By the third inning, both sides had fallen under the game's spell. The clatter of bats and gloves filled the prairie, a rhythm stronger than the wind that bent the guard towers. After that day, officers noted something remarkable. Fewer disciplinary reports, calmer mealtimes, cleaner barracks. The game had done what rules could not. It gave the men purpose. Reports sent to Washington described baseball as the most effective morale stabilizer observed in POW compounds. Soon, box scores were chalked on boards outside each barracks, rivalries tracked with mathematical precision. From Hearne to McAllister, from Oklahoma to Louisiana, word of the German leagues spread. The sport that once symbolized American excess had crossed the wire and found believers. In the dust of Texas, under the indifferent sun, former enemies played the same game, and for a few hours at least, forgot they were captives. By the summer of 1944, the Texas air grew heavy with heat and the smell of pine dust. But inside the wire at Camp Hearne, the rhythms of life had changed. Baseball had become the new common tongue, spoken in half English, half German, a hybrid dialect of sport and survival. Along the diamond, shouts rose in strange harmony. Der Pitcher wirft. Der Batter schlägt. Laughter followed missed catches and wild throws, words tumbling together until even the guards began to understand. The prisoners had forged their own vocabulary. The infield was the Frontlinie. The catcher became the Nachrichtenoffizier, the communications officer, and the outfielders were praised as Flankenschutz, the flank defense. A former engineer from Dusseldorf spent nights sketching diagrams, aligning base paths to maneuver warfare, offense as encirclement, defense as containment. Each game unfolded like a field operation, mapped in chalk and dust. The Americans watched with a mixture of pride and disbelief. German precision had infiltrated their pastime. Batting orders were typed on carbon copies and pinned to mess hall doors. Equipment was inventoried, rotations timed to the minute. Even the box scores looked like logistical reports. But beneath the order, something subtler stirred. The game had begun to erode the iron hierarchy that had once defined them. On the diamond, rank meant nothing. A corporal could strike out a colonel. A private could lead a team. What had been a barracks full of soldiers was now a league of equals. They learned democracy through baseball faster than through any lecture, one guard later recalled. By August, the sport had spread beyond Hearne's fences. YMCA War Prisoners Aid sponsored regional tournaments linking camps in Texas, Arizona, and Iowa. Teams traveled by guarded convoy, carrying hand-painted banners and dented gloves. The laughter that once mocked the game now filled the fields like music. What began as mimicry had become belief. For men raised in obedience, baseball offered a new kind of discipline, one chosen freely, one measured not by command but by fair play. By midsummer 1944, the guards at Camp Hearne had begun to notice something remarkable, an invisible change that rippled through the compound every time the bat struck wood. The tension that once hung heavy in the air was dissolving. Reports from the office of the Provost Marshal General began to circulate through Washington under a curious phrase: baseball as disciplinary goldmine. On game days, fights vanished. Escape attempts, once a constant worry, dropped to nearly none. Prisoners who had glared at their captors only months earlier were now shaking hands across chalk lines, smiling at men they still technically called the enemy. The sound of laughter and argument on the field replaced the sharpness of shouted orders. The war still raged across the oceans, but here, behind barbed wire and under a Texas sun, something softer was winning. Not everyone welcomed it. Senior Axis officers confined among their subordinates watched the transformation with alarm. In letters smuggled through neutral intermediaries, they complained that American softness was corrupting German discipline. Some forbade their men from playing, warning that sport bred complacency and moral infection, yet their prohibitions rarely held. The pull of the field was stronger than ideology. Even those who scorned the game would linger at the sidelines, eyes following each arc of the ball, each run home. In diaries recovered after the war, one Oberleutnant confessed, "We mocked their game and found our peace within it." By late summer, baseball had become the clock that structured their captivity. Practice at dawn, games by noon, quiet reflection by dusk. The Americans, watching from the towers and the bleachers, understood what was happening better than the prisoners themselves. This was re-education without lectures, victory without violence. Through the rules of a game, they had taught men raised in obedience to think, decide, and play freely. Baseball had succeeded where ideology had failed. It had turned enemies into teammates of an idea. 1945 came to Iowa with the scent of lilacs and the sound of trains carrying news from a dying Reich. Inside Camp Algona, nearly 10,000 miles from the ruins of Hamburg and Cologne. The war's last spring unfolded in sunlight instead of fire. The guards called it the Great Tournament. To the prisoners, it felt like something sacred, a farewell to the life they'd known and the world they had lost. 8 teams signed up, names scribbled in chalk across the mess hall board: Bremen Bats, Rhine River Club, Hamburg Hawks, Danzig Devils. The games were to decide more than a trophy. They would decide pride, sanity, and a sense of belonging. A carpenter from Hamburg, once employed in shipyards bombed to ash, spent weeks shaping the prize from scraps of barracks lumber, a bat and ball carved from pine, mounted on a rough wooden base. On May 5th, under clear skies, more than 2,000 spectators gathered. Prisoners in faded uniforms, guards off duty, even townspeople from Algona, invited by the camp commandant. Flags did not fly that day. Only scorecards fluttered in the breeze. When the championship began, the Bremen Bats versus the Rhine River Club, the air hummed with anticipation. Chants rose from the bleachers, German voices shouting team songs written only days before. Men who had once saluted in unison now clapped in rhythm, laughing, shouting, alive. The game stretched 9 innings. A sharp crack in the final frame sent the ball skimming down the third base line. 6-5, walk-off single, victory sealed. The crowd erupted. No salutes, no orders, just joy, pure and unscripted. They celebrated with lemonade from the canteen, shirts streaked with clay, faces red with sun and laughter. That afternoon, even the guards understood. For a few hours, the fences had vanished. The war had not ended yet, but its spell had broken. When the final cheer faded across the Iowa plains, it sounded less like triumph than rebirth, a peace announced not by surrender, but by the sound of a ball meeting a bat. By the summer of 1945, when the war in Europe was finally collapsing, a quiet triumph was already underway behind the fences of America's POW camps. What had begun as recreation now revealed itself as deliberate design. The War Department's Special Services and Special Projects divisions had long recognized that guns could end a war, but only ideas could prevent the next one. Baseball, they believed, could do what leaflets and lectures could not: reshape thought through habit. Internal memos written in dry bureaucratic prose described the policy as psychological rehabilitation through organized play. One report put it more simply: fair play fosters democratic temperament. To men raised under command hierarchy, this was a subtle revolution. On the diamond, they obeyed not orders but rules made and accepted collectively. The strike zone replaced the chain of command. Disputes were settled by consensus, not decree. Every inning rewarded patience, discipline, and restraint, virtues alien to fascism's machinery of obedience. Unlike the propaganda sessions they endured in earlier months, this lesson required no slogans. It taught democracy not by speech, but by experience. Sociologists who later studied the phenomenon called it soft power before the term existed. By autumn, inspectors visiting camps in Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin found entire German leagues operating independently, complete with printed rulebooks, elected captains, and meticulous statistics. The system had become self-sustaining. Each new arrival was taught by former players who now served as mentors and umpires. Baseball fields, once intended as distractions, had evolved into classrooms of civic behavior. When news of surrender reached them in May, many of those same men were already thinking like organizers, not soldiers. The Americans, knowingly or not, had proved that a nation's greatest export need not be its weapons. It could be its games, and through those games, its ideals. By late 1945, the gates of Camp Hearne, Camp Algona, and dozens of other compounds swung open for the first time in years. The prisoners filed out with duffel bags in hand, but many carried more than clothing or letters. They carried baseballs, gloves, and the echo of cheers that had once filled the barracks. Across Bremen, Hanover, and Munich, former POWs gathered in vacant lots, former parade grounds, and abandoned estates to form informal clubs, Krieg's Baseball Vereine. The game was improvised at first, with bats carved from scrap wood and balls stitched from leather remnants. Yet the memory of afternoons under the Texas sun gave them structure, discipline, and rhythm. American occupation authorities noticed the pastime's unexpected endurance. Through the Information Control Division, they provided equipment and even helped organize matches. By 1946, exhibition games between American GIs and former POW teams drew crowds, astonished to see ex-enemies laughing together over strikes, foul balls, and stolen bases. Former soldiers who had once saluted each other across battlefields now exchanged high fives across home plate. The spirit of Camp Hearne, the lessons of fairness, patience, and meritocracy had traveled across the Atlantic in their gloves and bats. Clubs such as the Mannheim Knights traced their origins directly to these POW leagues. Baseball briefly flourished in post-war Germany, offering an unusual bridge between conqueror and conquered. The first post-war German rulebook, still tinged with camp vernacular, opened with a line adapted from their time in America: "Fair play builds freedom." Though soccer would eventually reclaim dominance in the decades to come, the symbolic power of the diamond endured. The fences had vanished, but the lessons of the field remained etched in memory, a blueprint of cooperation, drawn in chalk lines carved from wood and struck from leather, a quiet proof that even in war's shadow, a simple game could teach liberty. By the late summer of 1944, the wire at Camp Concordia, Kansas, rang with debates almost as heated as any battlefield argument. German POWs had taken to baseball with vigor, yet not all embraced it without resistance. Die-hard soccer men, the foosballer, viewed the game as an encroachment of American culture, a concession to foreign ways that threatened the order of their own traditions. In the mess halls during laundry and along the barracks walkways, they argued weekly with the newly minted ballspieler, insisting that baseball was a child's pastime, slow and ornamental. The disputes were meticulous, almost academic, recorded in the camp newsletter, and occasionally noted by camp psychologists as indicators of identity preservation. Yet the contrasts were striking and instructive. Baseball demanded patience and calculation, each pitch measured, each base stolen, weighed against probability. Soccer, in contrast, thrived on fluid aggression, collective movement, and command from leaders on the field. Observers noted that these differences mirrored broader national temperaments. Baseball rewarded individual judgment and personal accountability, while soccer reinforced obedience to the group and the tactical hierarchy. The POWs, accustomed to Prussian precision, found baseball a strange but compelling discipline, a sport where merit could override rank, where success was earned inning by inning rather than shouted from a sideline. Over time, the dichotomy softened. Fields and schedules adapted. Saturdays were for soccer, Sundays reserved for baseball. Men began to appreciate the complementarity of the two games. Soccer's energy and fluidity balanced baseball's deliberation and strategy. The coexistence became a living lesson in compromise and cultural understanding. It was no longer about dominance or adherence to tradition, but about the exchange of values, a subtle diplomacy enacted through goals and innings. Within the quiet rhythm of these games, the first seeds of post-war reconciliation had taken root, sown in laughter, competition, and shared respect across lines once defined by ideology. By autumn 1945, while the war's headlines celebrated surrender and reconstruction abroad, a quieter revolution unfolded behind barbed wire in camps like Swift, Texas, and Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The Army Service Forces had long documented the phenomenon, though it remained classified from public view. Manuals and internal reports described recreation as morale re-education tools, singling out baseball for its unique ability to instill voluntary adherence to cooperative law. For men trained to obey without question, the diamond offered a new kind of discipline, one chosen freely, structured by rules, and enforced by peers rather than officers. New arrivals quickly found themselves under informal tutelage. Experienced POWs assumed the role of instructors, teaching the rules, umpiring disputes and guiding rookies through the rhythms of innings, at-bats, and base running. Guards observed the process with quiet satisfaction, noting that tensions eased as knowledge of the game spread. Re-education without resistance, one officer later wrote, aptly describing how the sport reshaped behavior without lectures or threats. Each pitch, each swing became a rehearsal in consent. Players learned to appeal decisions within limits, to argue without insubordination, to lose gracefully without igniting anger. The lessons of fairness, patience, and accountability permeated every play. Over time, the diamond became more than recreation. It was a laboratory of democratic practice. The rhythm of bat and glove echoed the rhythms of cooperation and deliberation, a moral retraining disguised as sport. Where propaganda had failed to penetrate ideology with words, baseball succeeded by example. By fostering voluntary participation, respect for rules, and mutual acknowledgement, the camps laid the groundwork for post-war democratization in occupied Germany. For thousands of men, the simple act of playing, listening, waiting, deciding, conceding became a blueprint for citizenship, a quiet testament that freedom could be taught, one inning at a time. By the early 1980s, decades after the last POWs had left the Midwest plains, historians began to trace the faint footprints of a forgotten chapter in World War II. Aerial surveys over Camp Algona revealed the ghostly outlines of baseball diamonds, chalked baselines still etched into the earth, the depressions of bleacher footings faint against the green. Archaeologists and volunteers excavated artifacts, splintered bats, scuffed leather balls, hand-stitched gloves that spoke of afternoons long past, of laughter and competition carried out under the watchful eye of guards and the relentless sun. These items, eventually displayed at the Algona POW Museum, offered a tangible bridge to a world where war and play had intersected. Letters and diaries unearthed in archives provided the human dimension. One former POW, writing in 1983, recalled, "In that field I first learned to choose. not obey. Across hundreds of pages, men recounted how afternoons on the diamond reshaped relationships, dissolved tensions, and taught lessons about fairness and cooperation that no classroom or propaganda pamphlet could impart. Documentaries followed, and university researchers began connecting POW recreation programs to early examples of cultural diplomacy, demonstrating how structured play could reshape belief, behavior, and identity. Scholars described baseball as a moral vaccine, a medium through which men conditioned under authoritarian rule could internalize values of consent, accountability, and equality. The rediscovery of these fields and artifacts rekindled public fascination with a story previously overshadowed by bullets and battles. What had begun as curiosity, an odd pastime tolerated behind wire, had grown retrospectively into one of the quietest revolutions of the war. Through the simple geometry of base paths and the rhythm of bat against ball, the human spirit had learned its own lessons in liberty and self-discipline. History's smallest stories, it seemed, could illuminate its greatest truths. In the long shadow of barbed wire, the diamonds endured as monuments to resilience, choice, and the transformative power of play. History often measures war in tonnage dropped, cities leveled and treaties signed, yet some of its most enduring victories arrive in quieter forms. On forgotten fields in Texas, Iowa, and beyond, men who had once saluted the swastika learned to tip their caps instead, to honor a game rather than an ideology. They mocked the sport at first, baffled by its seeming frivolity, but over innings and seasons, they came to recognize something far greater: the geometry of freedom, the rhythm of order without tyranny, the discipline born of choice rather than command. The crack of a bat became a surrogate for the crash of artillery. The measured sequence of the bases replaced the hierarchy of domination, and in those small gestures, a lesson in civility took root. When the prisoners returned to Germany, they carried more than luggage. They carried a blueprint for cooperation, fairness, and self-governance etched into memory through games played under a merciless sun. They built clubs, drew diamonds in vacant lots, and recalled with laughter afternoons when former enemies shared cheer and competition alike. The fences that once constrained them have long since vanished. The wooden bleachers have rotted into dust, yet in the quiet of open fields, the wind carries the faint echo of leather against leather, of gloves meeting balls, of voices lifted in joy. It is a sound that transcends conflict, a reminder that even in captivity, humanity finds its swing, that even behind barbed wire, the simplest of games can teach the greatest lessons. The field endured not as territory but as testament,